You're listening to the Staffroom podcast with Chey and Pav. We talk casually yet poignantly about the most relevant topics in teaching today.
So come on and chat with us because we love to engage in great conversation.
And welcome to episode 63 of the Staffroom podcast. Today we are talking about toxic positivity. Is it a thing? We are going to dive right into this conversation in just a moment. But before we do, we should probably introduce ourselves. My name is Pav, hashtag Wonder Woman Wander, and I am sitting next to my co-host, who usually introduces himself.
If you smell what the Staffroom podcast has got cooking.
There was a lot going on there.
I know multitasking isn't a thing, but if it was a thing, I just crushed it.
I wish we could have put that on video for everybody to see while you were doing that.
A lot of things going on to make that work, kiddies.
Yes, I know. And it was a lot of things.
So we are talking about toxic positivity. And of course, there's many reasons why we'd want to talk about this, but we'll start with a little anecdote.
I like that.
So, you know what? I write tweets every once in a while. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a tweet, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And I don't remember exactly what the tweet was, but it finished with, immerse yourself in your class space, and deliver some great lessons today. And I had someone not like it.
What?
And they didn't specifically not like it. It was, if someone thought this meant that, then they might think this meant that, and then this could possibly be deemed toxic positivity. And I didn't dismiss it in the bigger context. It's funny because the person that came over, I've never interacted with before, didn't follow me when I addressed him by his first name, because that's what one would probably do when one has conversations with people we didn't meet. He refused to actually engage on a name by name basis, and I still engaged in the conversation. At the end, I just said, okay, thanks, I'll think about this. And months later, of course, I've never had another interaction with the person again or seen them again. But I do know the people that liked all of his particular tweets quite well in the Twitter space. But you and I, from that point, just started to think a little bit of, what is this toxic positivity? What's our role in it? What's going around? What's our experience with it? What's the data say on it? Before we just dismiss this conversation, because if I follow the pillars of courageous conversation, I'll engage, I'll listen, I'll sit back, I'll reflect. I'm letting you speak your truth, despite the fact that you wouldn't let me speak mine. But
that's okay.
But
that's part of what it is.
And that was sort of triggered our long debate on this topic. But we weren't experts in it. We weren't totally familiar with it. So we've immersed ourselves in this topic.
But this is what we've sort of found, is nobody is really an expert in toxic positivity, because it's a relatively new sort of topic, right? Like it's only been around. People have only really been talking about this for a couple of years now. I would say 2, 3, 4 years. This idea of toxic positivity has really come out. And I think that we should start with a working definition of what toxic positivity is defined as.
Or we have a working one, because there are so many different interpretations, definitions, whether you get specific to overall toxic positivity, or if you start to lend yourself towards the education field. So yeah,
Right.
let's
Right.
get ourselves a little working understanding of what is toxic positivity.
And I think that most people would understand toxic positivity in this realm of social media. So that's sort of what our starting point is. So, what we found from psychologytoday.com is the phrase toxic positivity refers to the concept that keeping positive and keeping positive only is the right way to live your life. It means only focusing on positive things and rejecting anything that may trigger negative emotions. And this is roughly what you will find as a definition of toxic positivity on pretty much anywhere you search. This idea that having a positive attitude, positive mindset will overcome any negativity in one's life or surrounding one's life. So if we now take this idea and then we work it into, our sort of educational realm and how it applies to us as teachers, because this is what we do, right? We think about, all right, here's this idea that's popping up a lot on social media, a lot in our lives. How are we going to now work this into what our lives actually are? And a lot of that is education, is teaching. So how do we work this in? How do we define this so that it applies to our lives?
Yeah, because that definition component, there are many different slight variations of the definition. And
Yes.
in order to talk about it, we interpret the definitions and then we come up with our own working one. And I think one thing that came between us is it has to be this insincere was a word that came out often. It's this insincere sort of blanket platitudes of positivity in disregards of your truth. But I wanted to add one that I didn't necessarily see all the time, but I felt it was important that there's got to be some consistency to it. There has to be some notion that the person engages in this act with some frequency. Because if I start to think, if I didn't put consistency or frequency as part of the definition, then we are all never allowed to speak ever. Because we've all had that moment where we preach positivity. And you know why we preach some positivity? Because there is some data behind it that supports it. There is research that implies that when you sort of have that positive mindset in regards to things in your life that you can control, there is a benefit to having that positive mindset. And so if my car breaks down on the way to work, I can change my mindset to be able to get through the day on a positive, with upbeat, with progress. I can prevent that from destroying my day or ruining my day. And the data is there that in areas of my life that I can control and have complete control over, I can dictate my mindset in order to have a productive day. And I think this is sort of what leads maybe to what is toxic positivity, because people take that too far now to drop, I can just be positive about anything and everything. But I needed to come back to, there has to be, if I want to be mindful of my toxic positivity, that I reassess myself and am I doing it consistently? And am I doing it sort of like with complete disregard for the people around me, insincerity?
Right.
And I think that was really important for us, our working this through, because if we hold people to, you said one thing that was positive that wasn't, we don't give many people much wiggle room to speak.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was important that if we want to go after toxic positivity, let's make sure the people or the places that are delivering it truly are being insincere in their positivity on a consistent basis and a regular basis. Because I think we all got to give enough grace to people that if at one particular moment, one person was overly positive and trivialized your experience, we can give that grace to the one time, but if we move forward, then maybe we change it. So I thought it was important to my definition and our definition that consistency or frequency had to be a part of it, that working definition.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And, in the sort of the research that we did with regards to toxic positivity, one thing that we overwhelmingly found just in general. This is not talking in regards to our working definition, because we have really, gone through the iteration process with this definition over and over and over again over weeks. And sometimes, we'll have like an hour-long conversation on we need to fine-tune this definition. And then a couple of days later, we're fine-tuning it again because, we're finding that toxic positivity is a bit of a complicated thing. There's a lot involved with it, and there's a lot of misinterpretation of what it actually is. I think that toxic positivity was sort of born out of this idea that there's only positive things that are shown or posted on social media, and so people started to sort of say to themselves, well, I'm only seeing all of these positive things. Does that mean that I need to eliminate all of the negative from my life? Does that mean that I have to try to, emulate all of these people who have these seemingly perfect lives, and I have to sort of eliminate these ideas of negativity? So, this is sort of where it stems from. And there's lots. If you look up toxic positivity, I mean, you will come up with articles upon articles, podcasts, and all kinds of information about how toxic positivity can be harmful to your life. And we're not negating that fact. If you are toxically positive, then yes, it probably is impacting your mental health negatively. But the purpose of this conversation and the purpose of our conversation over and over again is to really establish, what does that truly mean in our lives as educators? And then how do we take that definition? And, we're seeing all of these people claiming toxic positivity within this world of education, but is that actually existing? Is that actually happening within education? Yes, in people's lives, sure, people can be toxically positive, but when it comes to in teaching, are we actually as teachers diminishing anyone else's experience? Are we consistently being so overly positive that it is, reducing all of the negative experiences to being potentially non-existent? So these are things that we have had to consider, and these are the things that we hope to really be able to discuss in our conversation today.
We want to fixate on the educational aspect, and certainly most of the dialogue is in the social media realm. But we do want to fixate on the teaching, and there's been articles related to teaching. There's 2 points you talked about, is that celebration of positivity. And then you talked about people talk about it all the time. And I think one of the issues is that a lot of people haven't taken the argument, the definitions, the proposed solutions to the nth degree to figure out where we go with it. And when we go with it, and I think this is more where our conversation panned off to, we both agree in toxic positivity in theory, and we can both relate to feeling a little bit of pressure. Not consistently, not relentlessly, but we both have felt that we've seen moments that you could define as an individual moment of toxic positivity, but I wouldn't label a person being toxically positive because it wasn't often enough to make that justification.
Right.
And certainly we've become more mindful in how we speak to make sure that we're not just bearing people's truths with our personalities or our positivity. So when we talk about our definitions, we believe it's a thing. It makes us more mindful of our language. It makes us more aware of the things around us. But when we start to talk about education, and then we expand the definition, and then we play it out, we get into some places that lead to some really rich debate. So when we talk about teaching and education, I had 3 dynamics. I had teacher to teacher, teacher to student, and admin to teacher. There may be more dynamics, but a lot of our conversations fixated on those. And I don't know, Pav, if you want to jump into maybe one of them, or if you want to let me go off on a little bit, but I think we set ourselves up nicely. We got ourselves a working definition. We know we sort of established our place in the sense that We know where we're at, and then we want to dive in a little deeply. And I think a great part was these three different dynamics of toxic positivity in our school settings, which is teacher versus teacher, teacher studstudent, admin teacher. And I'll jump in before I jump in, I'm jumping in on my own.
Before you let me jump in?
I just jumped in on my own talk. I'm jumping in, Chey. Okay, fine.
I'll just sit back. I'll watch this conversation.
Because what made this really interesting is that when you go looking for data, there is none. Unlike positivity and sort of those positive mindsets on those things you can control, there is data. There is research behind that. This is so new and so fresh. There's no data, and that's important. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious for the data to be collected, not because I'm going to disbelieve, not because don't think they'll find any. I want the data. Desmond Cole says the ability to not seek data is in itself the place of privilege. Yeah. So I definitely want data. I want to see this play out. But if I don't have data, you know what I jump to next? Action research. And you know what my action research is? It's my 20 years of teaching in a highly racialized school with a highly racialized staff. Because I bring that up because when we talk a lot of teacher versus student dynamic, a lot of the pushback on this is toxically positive often comes back to the anti-racist lens that we are putting students of color. We trivialize their experiences with toxic positivity in the sense that we just expect them to work harder and overcome things that, assuming it's within their control. And, they'll say the kindness folks. Although I've never seen those folks in real life. I've just heard people criticize about them because you can be kind, but and I'm just going to talk about my experience, but it's pretty vast. A school of like almost 1,000 kids, 20 years of experience, and you know how many times I've seen toxic positivity from a teacher to a student in regards to their situation and how they should overcome them. Never, not never, no never. I've never seen it. And so that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But I do know I've never seen a teacher dismiss so trivially a student's experiences. But I have taught and lived in a community where this is where a lot of that talk comes to. And so that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. But I certainly now have no data. And now I provide action research. And I have no action research of it either. But I have seen a lot more. Well, we'll get to this in a second. But so and just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it hasn't happened. But I'm not so naive to everything that's going on in my building that I miss 50% of what's happening. So let's assume I miss a little bit. It's still not a massive percentage. And I don't know if the percentage matters or not, but certainly if you were to dive back into a lot of these articles or people on Twitter making these statements, they jump a lot to this argument, but they can't share data. They haven't shared anecdotal experiences, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I still want to look. I still want to find out, but I got no data to refer to, and so the data I refer to is my action research, which is 20 years experience in a highly diverse community. And I've made my mistakes as a white male teacher, and I've learned a lot, but I've never, even on an anecdotal level, despite all my mistakes and all the learning I've had to do as a teacher, it's not that.
Yeah, I think, when it comes to that teacher and student relationship, you highlighted three: the teacher and teacher, the teacher and student, the admin and teacher relationship that exists. And, if we're focusing in, because we are teachers and we're talking about our sort of interactions, our daily interactions with our students, indeed, you are absolutely right that I don't think that I've ever been I definitely know actually that I've never been toxically positive with my students. I've never just said, you know what, you'll get over it. It's very much actually the opposite of that. This idea of emotional labor, which we came across with the very first time that we heard about this term was this morning as we were talking to Stephen Hurley on VoiceEd Radio. Chey calls in every Friday morning. I call in every Monday morning. We have a quick little 10-minute, 15-minute conversation with Stephen Hurley on VoiceEd Radio. And he brought up this idea as we were sort of debriefing about what we were going to talk about today on the Staffroom podcast. And he brought up this term called emotional labor. And it's this idea that teachers have this sort of expectation to bring emotional work into the classroom with them. And it's sort of this untold expectation, this unwritten rule that we have to bring these emotions into the classroom. And on the one hand, Yes, and again, it comes back to this idea that we're going to come back to in a few moments to talk about what we do see existing in the school setting in regards to toxicity. But we have brought these emotions into the classroom with our students. And so although we have never been I have never been so highly positive that we dismiss the things that are happening in our classroom, the relationships that we have with our students, and we see something happening in their lives and we just say, you know what, we just need to get through this with dare I say, use the word grit. You know, we just have to get through it. We don't dismiss the things that are happening in our students' lives. We don't dismiss, you know, if they come to school and they haven't eaten, we don't just say, you know what, just ignore it and it'll go away. You know, these are things that we don't do. We don't dismiss this stuff. We are not toxically positive. So, you know, as we were talking about this, and I completely agreed with you. I've never seen any data, first of all, to support that toxic positivity exists within that teacher and student relationship. And I have never seen any action research on this either. That, you know, I've never seen a teacher just dismiss a student and just told them to ignore their negative feelings and we'll get over it by just thinking positively. So it's a very interesting conversation, an interesting thing that we came across.
The one thing we have come across the most, and this conversation with Stephen Hurley wasn't triggered by the term toxic positivity. It was triggered when we expressed that because we have the articles we've read and we didn't have the data, and then we referred to our action research. But again, we understand that it exists, and because we understand it exists, it has made us very mindful of our behaviors. But when we come to our action research, the one thing we kept coming upon, and I kept calling it toxic positivity, but in our early discussions, you labeled, no. You said, Chey, this isn't positivity. This is productivity. Our schools are full or have a ton of toxic productivity in it, in regards to the expectations on ourselves, in regards to the expectations we put on people, either verbally, directly, or indirectly. And I could attest that there has been plenty, and I've probably conducted much toxic productivity. And so
I think as teachers, we all have. I think that this idea of toxic productivity is real. The fact that so many teachers take it upon themselves and then there's this is twofold, right? Like there's two parts to this. There's teachers who have often taken the responsibility of going above and beyond the defined role that they have as educators. And there's a lot of pressure for teachers to also do that. But then to put that pressure on other teachers. And I think that that's where things become toxic.
Whether direct or indirect. And that's why I commented at the beginning of that definition, when we celebrate or we're insincere. And so when you celebrate your successes as a teacher that have gone beyond the job description,
right,
all of a sudden, if you subscribe to toxic positivity and its definition and then you expand it, then you are naturally going to subscribe to toxic productivity because they're almost inherently the same definition. The insincere, overt celebration of the work you're doing that is not the job. And so I'll bash myself here early on. I used to really harp and preach all the time I would give as a gym teacher, and I would celebrate all our accomplishments. And of course, you want to on one vein, but when you start putting yourself in this lens of the toxic lens, what pressure was I putting on teachers by showcasing that I was coming to school every day an hour before, giving up my lunch every day to coach, giving up an hour every night to continue coaching, by giving my kids every single opportunity. You know, as an earlier teacher, I thought, this is what it's supposed to be. But when I started to reflect a little bit more before all this sort of came out, but as it started to come out, it gave me a better level of understanding that I engaged in what would be defined as toxic productivity. I overtly celebrated all the accomplishments and things I was doing beyond the job description that created great successes, but by this definition, by this working definition, and by expanding it through to its full end, if we are mindful of toxic positivity, then I would argue you need to be equally mindful of toxic productivity. And our real world examples will tell you that this actually happens more in our buildings than the opposite one, than the other one. And so that was one where I feel, you know what, now that I'm really in tune with that, I'm not going to celebrate those things. But then I start to worry one step further. Should I be doing those things? One thing, celebrating doing them. Because now I'll take it out of the gym realm for a second. Just for a second. Pat, you cut me off if I want. Let's say...
Yes, actually. No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
Let's say I'm a passionate language arts teacher. Now let's say I'm a passionate language arts teacher that spends all my summers spending all my own money, buying all kinds of other books and resources, and then posting it all over the place, that I'm reading all these things and I'm bettering myself. It sounds pretty good, but wait a second. You're putting a lot of pressure on me, inferring and implying that if I'm not doing those things, that I can't possibly be teaching at the highest possible level, because I'm not doing what you're doing, because you're all over the place celebrating all this extra stuff you're doing. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you put a lot of pressure on me. That's pressure on me to say, wait, do I have to justify that I can be a really valuable English teacher without going out and spending hundreds and hundreds of my own dollars and celebrating all the time, reading all over the summer? And of course, I do spend a lot of time in the summer doing a lot of extra prep work or extra PD work. I'm not trying to pretend I don't. But when we talk about toxic positivity, we extend it to toxic productivity. Now, what is it? What are real world examples? That's one.
Yeah.
That's one. Whether it be science, whether it be math, whether it be gym, anytime you're sitting there and celebrating all the greatness you're doing beyond the job description, which makes you this sort of teacher. I think I read somewhere the teacher rock star mentality. And of course, you and I have always held on to the notion actually that we're just two teachers. Mm-hmm. But I think that comes into it. So that this idea of toxic productivity, and I'm okay with it. Like on a personal level, of course I want you to go out and, get a resource if you want, show off that you're reading a great book. Maybe I'll say, oh wow, great, can I read that book too? Send me the information. But by the definitions of toxic positivity and toxic productivity, that's where it goes. Can we handle that? Are we ready for that? Have we thought about that?
Yeah. So just to take it back a little bit, I think that teachers in the field of teaching, this idea of toxic productivity probably happens more so than other fields that are out there. And I think it is because this is such a huge this is such a huge career. This is such a way of life of people. And not only do they want to better themselves as educators, but people also want to better themselves as people because it makes them better educators. And not to say that that doesn't exist in so many other fields, but there's no real cap. And this comes back to the emotional labor part. There's no real cap of, professional development, and that idea of professional development and personal development becomes so intertwined because as you grow as a person, you also grow as an educator. And so that line becomes extremely blurred for teachers. And so I think part of it is that when it comes to bettering ourselves, teachers tend to spend a lot of money, and not even bettering ourselves, but bettering our spaces for our classrooms. I mean, and nowhere do we see this more now than on social media. Like there are accounts that are just developed solely for the purpose of showing off what you were doing. And I use that term showing off very intentionally because oftentimes that is what it becomes. Of showing off what's happening in your classroom. And a lot of the time, much of the time, this is all stuff that teachers have spent their own money on because, who are we kidding? Our classroom budgets, especially if you're in a public school setting, are not massive. You've got a couple of $100 and you've got to get through the entire year on that couple of $100. We're spending tons of our own money. And this is like just, even if we're not spending it on tons and tons of resources, it flies. It just comes out of our pocket. And many of the time, us as teachers, we don't even think twice about that. And so as teachers, I think that we have a greater tendency to be toxically productive, or this idea of toxic productivity exists a lot more so with educators than other fields that we have seen. And so this pressure that we put on ourselves and on our colleagues to, one up each other constantly. I'm reading this book and this book and this book. What are you doing? What are you doing to make yourself a better teacher for your students? Because you know what? Everybody is watching. And there are all of these social media accounts that are just dedicated to showing off what's happening in these classrooms. And it's not even necessarily about money. It's about the time, as you mentioned, Chey. This is time that we spend. And although, yourself and me, we spend a lot of our extra time bettering ourselves, but now we are very mindful of the fact that not everybody has to be doing what we are doing, right? We are far more intentional with that idea, because we can't expect everybody to be doing all kinds of these extra things and to be giving up every moment of our days. Yes, when we were younger teachers, that's probably a possibility. Like, we could give up more time, but we didn't have families at that point. We didn't have children taking up our evenings. We didn't have all of these other things happening in our lives. And as we got older, we saw that, oh, you know what? This is not something that is sustainable all the time. We can't be expected to put all of these extra hours, extra money, extra time to be doing all of these things.
You don't have to be.
You don't have to be.
You can be an amazing teacher without. And when you talk a lot about those things, I would argue, or I guess, testify, I've been guilty of those. I've been reading this, I've been reading that, I've been reading this. What have you been reading? And now, instead of it sort of celebrating the reading and hoping people would join you, you realize it's toxically productive. It's putting undue pressure on people to perform and do the tasks that you have personally established as better for you.
Yeah.
And this is why when we got into the toxic positivity, that didn't really, get us too fired up. It's the extension of the argument. And we haven't even talked about some of the prescribed solutions. And some of these solutions is what led us to the idea of toxic productivity, because a lot of the solutions in regards to education talk about, you don't come into work early. When the work's done, you take it off. You take your full lunch. It's okay to not be okay at school. That's right. But then the extension of making sure you're only doing your job description, it leads to, as you talked about, it leads to some issues, because most teachers don't just do their job description. And then all of a sudden, are we really, this is a philosophical question now, can we really facilitate high-end learning if we just solely depended on teachers to fulfill the roles of their job descriptions? Because, I'll even go somewhere else now, you know what relationship building is? Not a job description.
Right.
It's not. I link back to Barry Schwartz. Practical wisdom is probably one of my favorite things to reference, but it's not education based. But it's examples, it's real world examples. It's action research is taking all kinds of people in all kinds of different fields, including teachers, and looked into what were the key factors to, one, personal fulfillment in your job and actually doing your job to a high standard. And you know what the common factor was? Never just following your job description, but knowing when the job description had value and knowing when it didn't, and knowing when to bend the rules in order to facilitate a better experience for everyone around you. And in most of those jobs, the one thing that it's never labeled how to interact with another human being. In fact, in your teaching curriculum, you'll never be told how to interact with a child. But we all know that the foundation is a great positive relationship, which we embed with our teaching and our curriculum. But this is part of when we extend the argument, we get into places that we're not going to be comfortable answering, or have we completely thought through? Because when we take all these arguments to this full extent, this is where we become. Like, is it possible to be an amazing teacher with just doing the job description?
Right.
I don't know. I'm asking because most of us don't.
No.
And probably none of us do. But when we sit there and we celebrate all the extra stuff are we doing, is this somehow toxic to other people? That maybe you're doing extra in other realms, but do they have to do extra in order to be a great teacher? So toxic productivity, that's a real thing in our schools.
Yes. And this is, this, and as we talked about this, we even came to the conclusion that, if we take that idea of toxic productivity, we can take that idea of toxicity and apply it to almost anything, right? So you can be toxically anything. It's when you start to, as we mentioned earlier, as we diminish the stories of the people that we are working with, or the students or other people in our lives, and we are consistently doing that over and over and over again, that is toxic behavior. And in our buildings, as we sort of came to this conclusion, the productivity is where we are seeing it the most, and not just, out there on social media. We're seeing it in our buildings. And something that I do want to highlight just very importantly is that regardless of where it's happening, whether it's happening in your buildings, whether it's happening on social media, what we really need to do is take that idea that you brought up about the practical wisdom, is we need to be able to find a balance within ourselves about, what parts do we need to be using in our classroom spaces, and what parts do we need to let go because it's not helping us in our classrooms anyway. So you can actually balance that relationship building and the parts of the job without actually feeling bad about it, without feeling like you've got pressure on you to be doing something that's not part of your job. This is the mental health aspect of it. And this is we can take this back to toxic positivity, right? You take what you want from social media. It's not, nobody is telling you that you have to be doing all of these things. And if we take a look, I was listening to a great podcast today, Science and Spirituality, and the topic was toxic positivity. And they had actually mentioned the whole point of social media is positivity. It's like a digital photo album that people share with each other. You're not going to put the negative stuff in your photo album because those are not the memories that you want to keep and remember. So the point of social media is to be highlighting. It's like a highlight reel of your lives. You put the highlights in there. And so when other people are looking at that, those people need to be aware that everybody is going to have the negative moments. Those negative moments are just not going to be showing up in the public realm. So if we take that back to teaching and education, those things that we're sharing, like I read 7 books in 3 weeks over the summer, they're not sharing the fact that maybe they had neglected other parts of their personal life during that time. That it's not just about the productivity, that there are other parts that might be neglected. And so I'm personally now taking it back to the mental health aspect, that teachers and people in general just have to remember that there's a balance to all of this, and that you have to take from the productivity, from the positivity, what helps you as an individual. And it is a personal balance sheet, and you just have to kind of do that for yourself.
It's been a great chat. We're way past 3 enlightened minutes time, but I think we can dive to our 3 enlightened minutes, give ourselves a little, and then come back in a quick. You're
absolutely.
Thinking your point and do it.
No, I was just going to say, I knew this was going to happen with this episode, and you were not as, I don't want to use the word nervous.
You were nervous.
I was nervous because I knew that we were not going to be able to keep it concise, because this is what happens every time we start this conversation. We just go and we go and we go and we go to another point and another point.
If you could make it concise, then it wasn't worth talking about because it was too easy to get through.
I guess you're right, but...
And I think one of the things that made us want to talk about this is for every person that's really poignant with talking about toxic positivity, there's 17 people that have joined the bandwagon and haven't thought it all the way through, and they rush to bring that to any argument to just sort of diffuse or put an end to it. And so this is a rich conversation because, when we talked to Stephen Hurley, it was the toxic productivity that got his attention. Toxic positivity did not.
Because I don't think that this is a concept that too many of us as teachers really think about. And this is something that I love.
Can't get enough fanboys on Twitter if you said toxic positivity.
No. This is something that I love about the dynamic between the two of us, is because we can delve into these conversations and go deep and deep and deep and really find these little nuggets and these little things that make sense to us, and so hopefully they make sense to you too, because I don't really remember. I don't know what I'm talking about anymore.
When we play back tomorrow, we'll either be critical of what we said or we'll say we got that one.
I don't know if I want to listen back to this one.
Let's get us into 3 enlightened minutes and wrap this thing up right after.
Absolutely. So today we have our friend Eric Anderson, and he is a ESL science teacher from Austin, Minnesota, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about higher order thinking in our English learner students. So Here is Eric Anderson talking about language and higher order thinking in our 3 enlightened minutes.
All right, Eric, thank you so much for that 3 enlightened minutes and those great insights on how to support English language learners in those higher end skills and those higher end activities that so often are just assumed that a student, because of the language barrier, can't engage in those type of learning opportunities.
Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Great segment there. And thank you, Eric, for that.
So this has been a great conversation.
Agreed.
We have not had an episode where we haven't talked specifically about something we've been doing in our class in a while.
Yeah.
But this has been something we've been stewing on for a little bit, thinking about, reflecting, reading. It wasn't just a one-off, as much as sometimes we think maybe on Wednesday what we're going to talk about Friday. We've had some stuff in the bank on this one.
This has been circling in our heads for months now. I mean, since we came on the scene and this whole idea of, what is this toxic positivity and why are people just throwing it out there, like calling everyone toxically positive all the time? We needed to do a little bit more research on this and really formulate our thoughts on what that is, what toxic positivity is. But then in general, what is toxicity and what is toxic productivity and how does it apply in our buildings with teachers as well? So I think that this was a great conversation between us.
I think one of those good articles was Julie Mason, and she was the one that listed, what do you do in regards to toxic positivity? And that's what got us thinking about toxic productivity, because when she lists her things that you do to combat toxic positivity, these are all things that were counter to being productive. Like you can't coach sports teams or a variety of any of activities if you're just coming in the 10 minutes before the day ends or taking your full lunch. You can't. So it opened our eyes to articulating what we were seeing and knowing in our buildings. And of course, this episode doesn't mean that we're right. It just means this is where we are right now. This is our appreciation. We believe that toxic positivity is a thing, that there is a way of continually to dismiss the truths of others through your sheer insistence on looking for a silver lining. It's sort of like the difference between empathy and sympathy. And so in this regard we're that positive mindset of always trying to put that positive spin on things beyond people's control. We'll believe it. We believe it in theory, and it makes us mindful of how we act and how we talk, and we do make sure that we're not trivializing other people's experiences, although I don't think we did before, but sometimes it's good to get just a little reminder. And we've used it to channel our tweets, but more importantly, who we are in our buildings and the spaces around us.
And the interactions that we have with our professional learning community and also the teachers that we have in our buildings and just in general and people, something that I really think about now is when I talk to other teachers, when I talk to students, when I talk to peers on Twitter, is am I diminishing your experience by putting my statement out there? Am I saying something that is going to maybe make you feel bad for something that you are living through at the moment? And so that it's just something that makes you so much more mindful.
I think part of the issue on this debate is people think they always have to have a solution for you, so they try to give you the silver lining, when ultimately, again, like back to empathy, I don't need to have a solution for you. I just need to be there for you, listen, and empathize with your situation, and then collectively work to find ways to try to make it better or to acknowledge that it can't be made better. I'm here for you in what you need, but not necessarily to say I can give you that solution. But we're also keen now on evidence.
Yeah.
And we'd love to hear anecdotal stories, because our experiences in a highly racialized community and a highly racialized staff is that there's very little toxic positivity, especially in that teacher to student realm, which tends to be the easy talking point in some of these spaces, is that dismissal. And then I believe that teacher to teacher, but our experiences now have really led us to believe there's far more toxic productivity placed on teachers, or teacher to teacher, or admin to teacher.
Admin to teacher as well, yeah.
That is far more prevalent that I can cite. I could go example by example by example, and then I could even attest to my own things where I'll reflect back on, say, you know what, that could be perceived as toxic productivity. I'm putting pressure on people to keep my pace, to do the amount of extracurricular I'm doing, to read the amount of readings I'm doing. And then the inference is that if you're not doing those things, then you can't possibly be teaching as good as I am. And that is completely and disgustingly erroneous.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm glad for this journey on my own self-reflection to put myself there.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
then you made, and cutting you off, but you made that great point that if social media is your only gauge, that we better define what social media is for. And it is for people to highlight.
Yeah, it's a
Period.
highlight reel. It's a highlight reel. Absolutely. Indeed. And just another thing that I wanted to throw in there, because I didn't do this earlier on when we were talking about this new idea of emotional labor, I wanted to credit the author of the article that we read, and actually the person who was talking to Stephen Hurley on his podcast, and that is Dr. Astrid Kendrick, and she is from Calgary, and she talks about this idea of emotional labor, and that teachers often have this responsibility to bring their emotions or to put aside their emotions in order to be able to better serve their students. So this whole idea of emotions in the classroom, we put in a lot of emotional work in our spaces. And so I just wanted to make sure I credit Dr. Astrid Kendrick for that amazing information.
Let's get ready to wrap this up.
Yeah, Chey, this has been a pretty amazing and reflective episode today on toxic positivity, toxic productivity, toxicity. Toxic positivity, is it a thing? I think we've determined that it is.
Is a thing.
It is a thing.
Along with the other toxic things that impact us in our spaces that we need to be mindful of.
Exactly.
And so what's our sort of swag bag? Our swag bag is that we're still working it out. We're still thinking. We're still engaged. And if we're still engaged, we're still learning. And this is our thinking right here now, but it might change tomorrow. It might change 5 days from now. We may have seen new truths, new experiences that are altered, because we are just two teachers reflecting on our vast experiences and our engagement with our PLN that just felt that this was the place we're at and this is where we wanted to have our conversation tonight.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I could wrap up, I could come back to my initial story that 4 months later after that tweet, the only toxic behavior was the insistence of looking for possible toxic positivity. A person that I've never interacted with again, never shared a name again, never followed me back, etc., etc., etc. But I stayed engaged. I stayed committed to the topic while you just flew in toxic. So you could debate whether my thing was toxic, but assuredly your action was toxic. So rushing to call people out on toxic positivity first doesn't necessarily make you right.
Well, it's, all of these people that are out there just hunting for that that toxic positivity. Isn't that a little bit toxic in and itself? So that's something to consider as well. I think
lots of things to consider.
Oh,
Let's wrap this up because we want to keep this under 30 minutes. We are Code Breakers. And if you're an aspiring author, make sure you check out their site for opportunities to share your story.
Our podcast is also featured on the Teach Better Podcast Network. So please check our Staffroom podcast there, as well as so many other amazing educational podcasts.
And you can also find us on our live stream show with School Rubric Office Hours every second Tuesday for now.
And lastly, but not least, you can catch us on The Drive on Sunday nights, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, where we host a wonderful live radio show with lots of great music and a little fun educational banter.
Everyone, thank you for joining us in the staff room.
We will see you next time.